I'd like to introduce Gráinne McGettrick, who will be joined online by Eyre.
Thanks very much, Dominic. It's absolutely lovely to be here this evening, and good morning to you, Harris. And welcome to the Prelude for Creative Brain Week 2023. And I suppose as the role of a prelude is to set the stage and whet your appetite for what's to come, I hope this next session will do that for you and encourage you to be part of this wonderful programme of events curated here at Trinity. What a start already. I'm really looking forward, though, to the next hour together. We've two wonderful speakers to lead the session and provoke further thoughts and ideas and set the scene and illuminate on the themes of the week around conflict, joy and imagination. So I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Eyre. And Harris is a physician and a neuroscientist who has had extensive experience in the business sector and in economic policy. Harris is originally from rural Australia, grew up on the Great Barrier Reef, and he currently resides in the San Francisco Bay Area. His mission and purpose is significantly influenced by his lived experience of migraines, which he will talk about now. And Harris, many other degrees and accolades can be found online for anyone who's interested. Harris's talk is entitled Brain Capital, a fresh approach for action and advancement. Over to you, Harris.
Wonderful, Gráinne. Well, thank you for that generous introduction, and it's good to see everyone. I should say g'day for my Australianness, but I'm actually calling in from a work trip in Houston, Texas, so I say howdy y'all. And so it's wonderful to be with you. I wonder if my slides are coming up so I can frame. Wonderful. So, excellent. Yes, thank you very much to Dominic and the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I've followed Creative Brain Week for since its inception, and many friends and colleagues have presented and expressed the excitement of the day. I'm sad that I can't be there. I look forward to getting to Dublin sometime soon and meeting with you all. I hope today that I can give you an updated sense of what we're doing with Brain Capital, and give you a sense of the freshness of it and the kind of aggressive nature of which we're trying to push this agenda. Next slide, please. And you can just, with all the slides, just transition through to the end of the graphics. Excellent. So this slide is outlining that we have a lot of major issues with the brain. We have trillions of dollars of economic loss with mental health and brain health disorders. We have, during COVID, what they say with education disruption is a generation lost education time, which is very sad, particularly it's impacting low middle income countries. And then, of course, we have the teenage social media challenges that we see in the news almost every day now. So there's a lot of issues, kind of despairing. But it's important to set the context that the human psyche is under a lot of pressure right now. Our brains and minds are under a lot of pressure. Next slide, please. So this is just another quick way of framing up brain challenges that we have. We have on the left-hand side the clinical brain challenges that we're aware of. Long COVID is a new one that we didn't know about until the last few years. Alzheimer's disease, depression, etc. And then on the right-hand side, we have non-clinical brain challenges. These are things that we maybe don't think about as much. In this is air pollution, which is toxic to our brains. Nanoplastics, we have the plastic products that we use are breaking down into our environment, into our food sources, into our waterways, and we don't actually know what that's doing to our brains, but the preliminary evidence suggests that it's quite concerning. Social media, in a sense, can be toxic to our brains. Doom scrolling, which a lot of us did, of course, during COVID, can be quite stressful. And then mis and disinformation, which, of course, is a major issue in Europe now, in particular with Russia disseminating a lot of disinformation. These things are a form of brain hacking. You could consider it that way. So the argument here with all these brain challenges is that we really need to think hard at a global level. How do we align ourselves between different interest groups, science, advocacy, the arts, to try to think about creative ways of addressing this? Next slide, please. So we say that the world is increasingly relying on brain capital, where a premium is put on brain skills and brain health. That is an individual's cognitive, emotional, and social brain resources. And thank you to Lundbeck for framing brain capital this way in their recent brain health position statement. Lundbeck is a Danish-based brain medication or pharmaceutical company. So this is what I'm talking about today, going from the problem that I've just outlined to getting to some kind of framework-based solution that we can think about using to try to address these issues at a global scale. Next slide, please. This is another way of showing brain capital across the lifespan. You can see from prenatal on the left to late life on the right. We're all on this spectrum somewhere, with the blue positive influences and the red negative influences on our brain capital. So we're all here. We all have family and friends on this spectrum, and then we all obviously work with different types of patient groups or consumer groups that are on this spectrum as well. So it's kind of interesting way of framing, a lifespan approach to this issue. Next slide, please. Very elegant description of brain capital is if we sort it out, if we optimize brain health and brain skills at scale, everything else follows. Productivity gets better, innovation and creativity gets better, and then well-being gets better as well. So if you think about like the country of Ireland, if we improved your brain health and brain skills to be highly optimized, the country would flourish even more in all these different metrics. So that's what this is all about. Next slide, please. This was another nice framing from the World Health Organization to say that investing in building brain capital is fundamental to meeting modern societal challenges, like we talked about, challenges like air pollution, but brain capital is also critical to driving innovation. So it's wonderful as brain capital has been advanced in the last 3 years for it to be picked up by the WHO and considered in their thinking is a testament to all of our colleagues that have worked together on this, and many of them are in the audience today, as I understand, in Dublin, and then also online as well. So thank you to all of our dozens, if not hundreds, of collaborators that have helped to put this together and to drive forward this new paradigm of brain capital. Next slide, please. So my brain story, I just want to share. I have grown up in northeastern Australia. I started suffering from migraine headaches when I was a teenager. That means that when I was a teenager, I would get vision changes, like you can see in that center top graphic there, that lasts for about an hour. So I can't do anything when that happens. The triggers are unknown still to me. After that, I would get 4 hours of a deep throbbing pinpoint headache deep in my brain that was very unnerving and unsettling and uncomfortable, would cause vomiting, nausea, and then ultimately I would be, for the next day, really washed out and feel really bad. So this is my story, that I developed these migraines when I was a teenager, inherited from my mum's side of the family, and I have been living with them since then. In the early days of my life, it was despairing because none of the medications worked that I tried, that the neurologist prescribed me. So I had this sort of trial and error issue to deal with. So it was a very, despondent. I was a very despondent individual when I was getting these things. But of course, this has changed my life in many ways. It really led me into medicine, into a caring profession, which led me into the brain field as well, and neuroscience, because I was interested in understanding, what on earth is going on. Why can't the neurologist explain what's going on in my brain? And if you go to the next slide, it's fundamentally led me then beyond clinical medicine and neuroscience into the business side of the brain, recognizing that when we have good science, we need to develop it into products and services that we can scale to get to millions of people, ideally. So scale and impact is very important to me. And now, of course, brain capital is a form of large-scale policy intervention that we're making. And it's important to say that this bottom right-hand point here, there is a new medication that I started about 3 years ago called, well, the name's not important, but it's a new fancy medication that is available in the US based on an advanced neuroscience innovation. So I'm very grateful now. I'm treatment responsive. The only symptom that I get is the vision change. I don't get the headaches, I don't get the nausea, the vomiting, and then feel bad the next day. I literally just have 1 hour of vision issues, which is still not ideal, but then I can get straight back to my life. So I'm very grateful that neuroscience has led to this new medication. But I recognize full well that this medication is only available in America. So it's not available. If I was living in Australia, I wouldn't be able to access it, or in any other country, it's not accessible yet. So that sort of shows you, sort of, in a sense, inequity of these things. And I'm also very grateful that in the US, my insurance plan subsidizes this medication, which otherwise would be very expensive, is essentially free for me. So that tells me that, insurance coverage is critical. And when you don't have insurance coverage, it would be really challenging. So I recognize the sort of good fortune that I have. So this is my brain story that I wanted to share with you about what drives me personally, and then how it's influenced my career over time. Next slide, please. So I wanted to say that my migraines I see as a superpower. I can say this now that I have some treatment responsiveness. I have some respite from the sort of more challenging, painful parts of my migraines. Now I can say that upon reflection, that it gives me more empathy and compassion for people that are living with brain disorders that neuroscience can't fully understand. My migraines have given me a purpose in life, as you can see through my thread of the things that I've done in my career. I recognize global inequities in access to medicines, and also in access to insurance. There are other health benefits of having migraines. Interesting that my neurologist told me, hey, Harris, it's interesting that people that suffer from migraines, or people that live with migraines in their 30s, generally they have a much healthier lifestyle because they have to try to keep their lifestyle as good as possible, sleeping well, eating well, not drinking in moderation, because people like me are fearful that we don't know what the triggers are of our migraines. We just try to keep everything good, right? Just be healthy. So that means that actually the studies have shown that people like me are less likely to get heart disease and Alzheimer's disease in old age because we're just really healthy, because we're fearful that if we're not healthy that we might get a migraine. That's kind of interesting. The final two things I'd say is that these migraines have forced me to try to have creative practices in my day-to-day life. Basically, I don't want to work too hard grinding away, because that could potentially trigger a migraine. So if I can have some kind of creative flash of insight and advance my work very quickly, that's great. It's sort of easier on my body, if you will. And then, of course, that means that to enact a creative idea, you have to work in teams. It can't just be me doing it. I need to work effectively in teams. So these are all the beneficial outcomes of my migraines that I wanted to share with folks as a way of framing the positive aspect of a brain disorder, which I hope is useful. We tend to just talk about the negative side of it, but hopefully thinking about the silver linings can be helpful to some folks. Next slide, please. I wrote up my short story for EFNA, the European Federation of Neurological Associations, so it's available online if anyone has an interest in reading it. I'd love any feedback, or also I think we should try to create a movement of people talking about their challenges, the brain disorders that they're living with or have lived with, and the silver linings of them, because it might help us to balance out the discussion to look a little bit more favorably upon these things if we can. Next slide, please. So we have this brain capital grant strategy, getting back to the crux of what I'm talking about today, which included a dashboard. So, brain capital is a theory, as you've seen me talk about so far, but a dashboard is a way of quantifying this globally, country to country. We think about brain capital in all policies, not just how do we improve brain capital in in the health sector, social sector, but also on the internet sector, infrastructure, environment sector. Think about all the different ways across the government that we have policies being made. We need to think about how all of these influence our brain capital. And then the third thing to say is that if brain capital is an asset, then you could potentially invest in it and build it. So we need to think in our grand strategy about novel ways of investing in brain capital, like venture capital or different bond mechanisms. It gets into sort of the arcane financial innovation, but it's an interesting area where we could potentially get a lot of benefits in the future. And then the final point down the bottom there is as part of what we're doing also is rethinking neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is all striving for efficiency for the world and the economy, and it's obviously can wear people down. So we need to think about what's a potential new way of thinking about how to run our economy, build in more resilience, more care for people, more care for our environment. Very complex to know how to enact that, but that's part of what we're thinking about with our work. Next slide, please. This is just to say that we have created a neuroscience-inspired policy initiative with the OECD, and you can Google that if it interests you. It shows all of the different articles that we've published or that have been written about our work over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. And now we have, growing out of that OECD initiative, the Brain Capital Alliance, which is a multi-organizational structure. And you can check this out online. It's a way that we keep track of all the work that we're doing, our working groups and publications. Next slide, please. This is a way that economists have framed up brain capital to say that brain capital has in the middle a health and a skills dimension. It has boosters, it has impeders. And you can see there that there's a bidirectional relationship between things that boost and reduce brain capital and then policies and businesses and individuals. So it's trying to think about how do we make brain capital something that can be visualized, if you will. Next slide, please. This is the draft of the Brain Capital Dashboard, which you can find on the website of EMEA, the Euro-Mediterranean Economist Association, which is our collaborating think tank based out of Barcelona that is driving this dashboard project. So the dashboard, you can click around on it. It talks about why the dashboard is needed, how it was developed, and then there's an interactive map where you can dig into country by country data on brain health and brain skills, and then environmental determinants of brain health as well. This is just a work in progress, so open to any feedback that people have when you look at it. How do we make this better? You also see that for many countries, data just isn't available. So that's part of this exercise, is to point out gaps in the data. If some certain country doesn't have data, it really behooves us to try to help that country to capture the data so that they can have a sense of their country's brain capital. Next slide, please. And I'm getting to my last few slides now. This was a wonderful paper published earlier this year by an executive at AARP, which used to be the American Association for Retired Persons. So it's all about the health of older adults, talking about the benefits of brain health to our economies. Sarah outlined on the left lifestyle behaviors for healthy brain aging, and all of these things you'll be hearing about throughout the week, about eating right and sleeping enough. But then on the right-hand side is where it gets interesting, the benefits of this type of healthy brain aging at a population level. You can see there reducing dementia, etc., increasing brain capital. So it's wonderful to see that brain capital, again, is being taken up in these different fora. Next slide, please. Another piece of work that we've been doing, and a shout out to my colleagues, Walt Dawson, Agustin Ibanez, Laura Boy, and many other folks in the crowd as well that have helped us with this. This is trying to leverage diplomacy constructs, foreign relations constructs, how to, like ambassadors, try to improve things for people across the world, across countries. Well, we thought, how do we apply those principles to brain health? How do we ensure that all of us in the audience today are sort of trained in those principles of international relations? And what ultimately we started with a theoretical paper that we published down bottom right there, and now we have an actual toolkit that we've developed specifically for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think Agustin Ibanez is in the room there. If anyone has questions, please ask Agustin, and he'll be happy to answer them for you. Next slide, please. It's another new project that was launched last year, the Quantum Healthy Longevity Project out of London, out of the UK, which is all about thinking about new ways to improve the health and well-being of older adults. And it was wonderful. You can see the third part of the blueprint is mobilizing brain capital. So investing more at a national level in the United Kingdom or a regional level to invest in brain capital, being super important to the health and well-being of the economy as well of that country. And then there are a bunch of other interesting areas talking about exposomics, leveraging technology, intergenerational engagement, democratizing access, and ensuring that compassion is part of healthy aging and healthy longevity. So I encourage you all. We published this late last year. You can check it out if it interests you. It may have relevance to other countries around the world as well. Next slide, please. We have talked about brain capital in a bunch of different fora around the world, including last year at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we were talking about the role of the environment in influencing the brain. So like air pollution is part of the environment, green space, forests, climate extremes, all these things are influencing our brain, and then conversely, our brain is influencing the environment. If we're more ecologically intelligent, so that's not emotional intelligence, but ecological intelligence, that's making right decisions about the car that we drive or the food that we eat, or if we're using single-use plastics or reusable water bottles, things like that. The brain does have an influence on our environment through the decisions that we make as consumers. So kind of an interesting interplay between the environment and the brain, and we want to really drill into this in the coming years because it's obviously super important, and climate change is an existential risk to humanity, but really not many people are talking about the role of the brain in this debate. So again, as creatively, one of the great things it'd be good to get out of the Creative Brain Week is how does the brain interact with climate, and what do we do about this, and how do we optimize our brain through the climate change that's occurring in the next couple of decades. Next slide, please. So Dominic asked me to present where is this all going. I hope you can see that we've gone from theory into some practical projects and uptake into policy fora, but in the future, we're looking to establish a lab at the Baker Institute here in Houston, Texas, where I'm based today. That would be wonderful as a way of helping us to formalize things and to sort of land at one institution. We want to advance our brain capital dashboard and every year do a monitor where we're doing like a reflection on global brain capital practices, talk about the gaps in the literature, talk about countries that are doing well, countries that aren't doing so well. We want to go after grants that can allow us to have a systemic impact, and we want to continue to push and mobilize and energize people because this is really a global movement that we need to try to affect change on people's brain capital at scale. Next slide, please. So that's all. Thank you. I hope that this was interesting to you, and you can see that we're doing our best to make some positive change and bring some hope into the brain discussion, broadly speaking. So look forward to any feedback that people have. Very open to constructive feedback and ways that we can do better and have more impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harris. And thank you for bringing us on that kind of global journey in relation to how brain capital is really energizing policy initiatives right across the world. and really coming into a whole range of different spaces where we're going to have to, I suppose, work together in an interdisciplinary way to really solve the problems that we're trying to address here as part of Creative Brain Week and within GBHI. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask if anybody has one question from the audience, if you're interested to ask Harris a question before we move on to the next speaker for this session. So just ask you, maybe perhaps say your name and be concise in terms of your question, please. Thanks. We have a microphone. Dominic is nobody.
Thanks, Dominic. Hi, Harris. Alejandro here. Thanks very much for that presentation and for sharing your story. That was great. Brain capital is a fascinating concept, I think, and it's going to be very important to give it the right nuance. Because I'm afraid that it could fall into the wrong oversight of enhanced capitalism and enhanced productivity. So how do we protect, particularly the countries that are more vulnerable at the moment in brain capital-wise, and those who are basically at the beset of our capitalistic society at the moment? So how do we roll out policies to help them first, perhaps, to cement the brain capital before we invite perhaps bad elements or bad actors into the whole mix?
A very good question, Alejandro, and a good challenge. We're doing our best to speak to both sides of politics, to speak to more conservatively minded people because they're in power, half the time, and they're important change agents. So to them, we speak a little bit more about the productivity boosting parts of this. To the progressive parts of politics, we talk more about well-being and collective intelligence. So we're really trying hard to be non-partisan or bipartisan, just to try to affect change and get advancements. But very sensitive to the issues that you mentioned. I would say, first of all, that wouldn't it be lovely if in our economy we didn't always just think about productivity? We thought about GDP plus well-being, GDP plus brain health. I think so that there's sort of a big reform that needs to be done, and I think we're seeing that in a lot of the well-being economics movements, that people are actually now not just looking at GDP but well-being, and that's starting to take hold around the world. And then finally, yes, there is a risk that for sure, corporate interests will start to try to look at brain capital as how do they squeeze more out of it, how do they extract more brain capital out of low middle income countries, and that's a challenge we need to be wary of. I think just if we start to measure brain capital, it makes sure that if, say, we see in a country, Argentina, that brain capital is going down because maybe someone's squeezing brain capital, then we actually put a spotlight on that. We say, hey, Argentina's brain capital is going down. Let's put a spotlight on it. Let's take different parts of the UN there, WHO, different civil organizations, philanthropists, and then that actually puts a spotlight on the problem, and then we can go and fix that problem. So measuring, I think, will help us to sort of work out benchmark-wise which countries are doing well that we can applaud, which countries not doing so well, and how do we solve that problem. And that may for sure mean kicking out some company or highlighting the unethical practices of some company. And if that's it, then that's the way. The data will speak to that. But then I think the final point is to say that also one of our colleagues is a chief economist of PwC Nigeria, and he actually has written a white paper about boosting Nigeria's brain capital to basically saying, like, instead of all of the many people in Nigeria immigrating to other countries and Nigeria losing a lot of people, particularly their most educated people, how do they retain those folks in Nigeria and create a good society and good jobs and stuff for those people locally? So it can, on the flip side, it can be actually positive to use this framing if it's done creatively. And so that's Andrew Nevin wrote that white paper on brain capital in Nigeria that people may find interesting. So I hope that, Alejandro, is some useful reflections to your point.
Thanks, Harris. Thanks very much. And Harris, thank you very much for engaging with us here in Dublin this evening, and good morning to you. So, and I look forward to further engagement with you. As a policy wonk, I'll be back to you. So to move on to the next speaker, it's my greatest pleasure to introduce you to Professor Brian Lawlor. Professor Lawlor is Conley Norman Professor of Old Age Psychiatry and the Site Director for the Global Brain Health Institute. He's a geriatric psychiatrist with an interest in dementia and later life depression, loneliness and brain health. Brian has worked for over 30 years in developing services and delivering care for people with dementia. His research interests include early detection and prevention and evaluating treatments for dementia. Brian is going to talk to us on the theme of hope, which he has been exploring in depth, and a theme that is highly relevant to the Creative Brain Week. Brian's talk is entitled, "What is Hope and Why Do We Need It Now?" Thanks, Brian.
So it's a great pleasure to be here this evening to talk to you about hope, and I'm sure at this hour of the day you're probably hoping that I'm not going to speak for too long, and I'm not. So what is hope and why do we need it? And I think it ties in actually with Harris's story. Harris' story about his migraine, I think, is a story of hope, and I think it's quite a powerful story of hope, and that's really where I come in terms of my interest in hope. And you know, as a practicing old age psychiatrist over the last 30 years, dealing primarily with people living with dementia, it's struck me that how important it is that when you're dealing with people with a condition like dementia, where there's great uncertainty, the importance of being able to instill hope. And many times over the last 20, 30 years, families would come back and say to me, you know, and tell me about, quote back to me something that I would have said to them and to the person living with dementia that made such a difference to them at that time. And I perhaps wouldn't have a good recollection of that at all. But it really struck me how important it is that what we say and how we say it and how we deal with the person living with dementia, with their family at that time, particularly around the disclosure of the diagnosis, is so important. And the concept of hope and how hope helps and how it heals and how it sustains, how it helps people get through a very, very difficult time. So that's really where I began to look into the concept of hope and the importance of hope. Oftentimes when you think about dementia, I mean, it's very much a tragedy narrative. People think very, very negatively. It's very stigmatized. And oftentimes it's very much a sense of tragedy, and there's very little hope. And you can see here from the slide the types of terms people use oftentimes in media when they talk about dementia. So about several years ago, I was involved in a national awareness campaign around dementia called Understand Together. And really what we wanted to try and do there was change the narrative, talk more about positive stories, lives lived well with dementia, and telling stories that, again, change the narrative from tragedy to more one of hope. And very much the bottom line is that, you know, there are things that you can do to improve your brain health, even if you have dementia. So, brain health is really about protecting your brain, reducing the risk to your brain, improving the brain's plasticity. And one very important concept for me is that you can reframe dementia from the perspective of brain health. And the story is that you can have brain health even if you have dementia. And I think when you tell the story that way about, you know, reframing dementia from the perspective of brain health, you are able to change the narrative from a sense of tragedy to more one of hope. But very much more so than that. I mean, I believe that hope can nourish the brain and is key to its health. And for that reason, we need to understand hope much better and more deeply. And if you look at the themes over Creative Brain Week, you have themes of conflict, which we heard a lot about today. We heard about imagination. We also heard about joy. And hope can be the thread. That can be the pathway leading from conflict through imagination and to joy. So, you In terms of understanding hope and what hope means and how hope can heal and help, let's take a deeper dive. So, again, oftentimes we can recognize hope when we experience it, but it's quite difficult to describe what it is. It's hard to define hope. So one thing about hope is very much about imagining and reaching for a better future for ourselves, perhaps to a place of joy. Now, hope is both a feeling or an emotion, but it's also a way of thinking. And while we experience hope in our brain, oftentimes hope comes from somewhere outside of ourselves or from someone outside of ourselves. And that brings it back to that relationship between the doctor and the person living with dementia, because it's within that context of that caring relationship, a relationship of trust, that hope can grow. So hope is very, very important in times of uncertainty and adversity. And of course, there's a lot of that out there right now. And oftentimes people misconstrue optimism and hope. And hope is certainly not optimism. I mean, optimism is always a belief that something is always going to work out. Everything is going to work out. That's the optimist, the person who's optimistic. But hope is different. Hope is a belief that there's potential to secure a better future. And hope is not active. Hope is not passive. Hope is very, very active. You really have to work at hope. So hope is very active and not passive. So hope is much more active than optimism. It's a feeling and a mindset that you have to work at it in order to achieve your goals, despite trying and extenuating circumstances, despite these adversities. So hope has two systems of operation, and I touched on this already. You have the thinking side and the feeling side, the cognitive and the affective side. But they work hand in hand, and they're both very, very important and necessary as an effective therapeutic tool at the individual and at a collective level. So on the far right, you can see the emotional side of hope, which is really important. It's this sense of trust, care, and caring. That often comes from outside of the individual, from other people. The thinking part of hope, there are two parts of that. There's the sense of motivation and goals, that's the will, but also there's a second part, which is the way, which is the pathways for action. So you have to have a motivation, a sense of agency, but then you also have to have pathways in order to be able to affect and move along this hope pathway. So, for example, when dealing with people living with dementia, I mean, there is the important part is the trust, the care, the caring that comes from outside of the individual. But you also have to try and help with the motivation and outline and provide pathways for that individual in order for them to be able to sustain their well-being and their brain health. That's why the brain health framework is really important when dealing with people living with dementia, because it gives them agency and pathways. Again, this relational aspect of hope, this sense of caring and trust is really, really important. And again, in this therapeutic relationship between the doctor and the person living with dementia, it's very much key. So in times of uncertainty, and as I said, in the world that we live in right now, or if you're dealing with a difficult diagnosis like cancer or dementia, hope is really, really important. And it can come from many places. You have to develop the will, the agency, have to have the pathways, and in that way then hope can sustain you at a very, very difficult time. So how does hope work for and in the brain? So if you experience hope in the face of adversity, your brain works better, it works more efficiently, and you're more likely to take positive decisions about your health, like adhering to medications. When you experience hope, it dampens down the anxiety circuits in the brain, so your brain function improves. And more so than that, if you feel hope, and you tend to look for information and opportunities that help resolve problems and conflict. And this is a really important part of hope. And certainly hope can be very useful in times of conflict because it helps you to move towards looking for information and opportunities that might help resolve the problem that you're facing. So hope decreases anxiety and fear around the time of diagnosis. It can facilitate action. It can help you to focus on what you can do and not what you can't do. It can help adaptation to illness and facilitates participation. And when you think of looking at caregivers, where caregivers experience hope and look for a hopeful outcome, that can have many positive benefits for the person who has the illness, or particularly a person living with dementia. So hope is really important for the person dealing with adversity, dealing with an illness. Now, the flip side of hope, of course, is fear. And fear is hope turns inside out. And what fear does, it actually takes away from hope. It disempowers hope. It paralyzes action because people become much more anxious. So when there's anxiety and fear, it sucks out the motivation from you to carry on. So it's really, really crucial that we push hope, try to instill hope, and decrease fear. So one thing about dementia over the last while, and certainly is this great fear, and most people over the age of 50 fear getting dementia more so than they fear getting cancer or having a stroke. And when this fear erases hope, despair tends to slip in. And of course, this was how people felt about cancer about 50 years ago. The big C, great fear, great stigma, little hope. But of course, the attitude to cancer has changed very dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years. It's now seen as very much a treatable condition. And I think this is going to change for dementia as well, I think over the next 10, 20 years, not just because there are going to be drug treatments that will slow the rate of progression or perhaps even prevent dementia, but because of all the other things that are happening and because of this perspective on brain health, this framework of brain health, the belief that there are things that we can do to improve people's well-being even when they have dementia. And this is where I think the intersection of brain creativity, arts, and brain science is really, really important. Because we can turn the fear and stigma of dementia inside out and generate a greater sense of hope. We often think of hope at the individual level, but hope can be there as a collective. And I think during the pandemic here in Ireland, we saw how the hope of a nation hinged on the evening briefing from Tony Holohan. And the careful articulation of pathways to action, but also information and given with a sense of trust and caring. And I think most people in Ireland experience great hope during those briefing sessions. So why should we hope in times of conflict? Well, hope and the will to keep going is a top-of-mind concept if we are to resolve conflict and create individual, systemic, and societal changes. And that's one of the themes that we're going to be dealing with during Creative Brain Week, and particularly tomorrow. And as I say, hope can help you move towards looking for information and opportunities that can help resolve problems. Now, there are many advantages to hope, particularly for your brain. If you're hopeful, you not only feel better, but your brain operates more efficiently. We know that you perform better on cognitive tests if you're hopeful. We also know that you are able to deal with adversity, with conflict more efficiently, more effectively because of the will, the motivation, and the pathways. But hope is not a given. As I said, it's active, it's not passive. You have to work at it. And it's important that you connect outside yourself for it to take root and to be experienced in your brain. So I just want to leave you with a final thought. I guess this is a very difficult time in terms of the world, in terms of the conflicts, and I think we need hope now more than ever. Hope can be a powerful elixir for health. Trust, caring, and setting realistic goals aimed at well-being and quality of life can turn fear and stigma inside out. So whether you're facing a serious illness, experiencing economic hardship, or if you're feeling conflict or overwhelmed or actually tackling global inequities right now, I think now more than ever, we need hope to sustain us in a world that increasingly doesn't seem to make sense. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Brian. And I can't think of a nicer way to finish off the Prelude this evening and to introduce the rest of the week in terms of Creative Brain Week. So I appreciate very much all those fabulous thoughts. And thank you for coming. And thank you to Dominic for curating this afternoon. And we'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you.